Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Network 2020's discussion about economic and political cooperation in North America, particularly in this pivotal election year. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. Welcome also to those who are joining us for the 100th time. For those of you who don't know, Network 2020 is a New York City-based nonprofit, and we really try to provide access to leading thinkers and doers in international affairs for our audiences in New York and around the world. So we're really trying to bridge that gap between the private sector and the international affairs community. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speakers, our panelists for today's talk. First, I'd like to welcome Goldie Hyder, who is the president and CEO of the Business Council of Canada, which counts as members more than 170 chief executives and entrepreneurs of Canada's leading companies. He is also, interestingly, the host of the Speaking of Business podcast, where you can learn about Canadian innovators, entrepreneurs, and business leaders. So welcome, Goldie. Next, or soon, we will welcome Joshua Meltzer. I will introduce him now. He is running a few minutes late, but will be joining us shortly. He is Senior Fellow at Brookings, where he works on international economic relations with a focus on the intersection of digital technology and international trade and investment. There, he leads the USMCA initiative, which focuses on how the USMCA can strengthen international economic cooperation in North America. And last but not least, welcome to Dr. Pamela Starr, who is Professor of Practice in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Southern California's Center on Public Diplomacy. She spent 8 years in Mexico as Professor of Latin American Political Economy. So welcome to the three of you. It is a pleasure to have such a breadth of knowledge in the room today. So what I'd like to do, I'll start with you, Goldie, and then turn to you, Pamela, just for a bit of an overview of the situation and the perspective from your own area of expertise in terms of, how the evolution of NAFTA into USMCA, what impacts you've seen, either, with you, Goldie, in the private sector, and then Pamela, when we turn to you, what you've been hearing from Mexico. So Goldie, I'd love to if you could just give us an overview.
Perfect. Well, Courtney, thank you for having me, and a pleasure to be here, of course, with Professor and with Josh. Humbled by their company. It's going to be a good conversation because we find ourselves in that dangerous place of living in interesting times, and a lot has happened. We thought the getting to this place just to have a USMCA agreement was a near-death experience enough for Canada, and yet we find ourselves sort of a little over halfway through it, already looking forward to the renewal process that was put in place, really with American insistence, if you will, to have that 6-year thing. And for business, I struggle with the words because it is frustrating to see, to some extent, that there's a sense of here we go again. And we're getting ready for that. We don't know what's going to happen in November. Obviously, the American public the American electorate will make a choice, and we'll deal with the fallout of that. Both sides have, however, said that they feel that this is less about tinkering and much more about renegotiating, which is disturbing and alarming because that's not what the intent was, I don't think. The notion was, why don't we just take stock of where we are 6 years into the thing, or 5 years into the thing, and then maybe there's a thing or two, but overall let's give it the trajectory, because after all, the previous iteration was obviously decades old, and so you don't want that, but you don't necessarily also want to be put in a place from a business perspective where that unpredictability and that uncertainty of who knows what comes out the other end. When you open it all up, it's it's like pulling on that thread. Everybody wants something, and then the next thing you know, the whole thing unravels, and there's this uncertainty where capital will chill, it will freeze. And that is very concerning if you're trying to not just strengthen your own country, but I've always come at this, and I think Canadian businesses have always come at this as, how do we help the neighborhood? How do we strengthen North America? Because at a 64,000 foot level that you've asked for the question, the world is really breaking down into blocks. What we're seeing is there's strength in numbers, that if you come together and find a way to work together, if you look at Europe, which is held remarkably strong through the European trade agreements and others. If you look at even Africa, it has an intercontinental or a continental free trade agreement. If you look at the Asian bloc through the TPP, which of course I know includes Chile and others, but even beyond that, if you look at the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the largest trade agreement with a third of global GDP, a third of global population, and it has not only Australia in it, it also has China in it, which goes to show you that the rest of the world seems to be finding a way to work together to address big issues like supply chain resiliency and so forth. And in North America, we seem to be wrapped up in irritants when we really need to get our act together. And let's hope that we come out of this stronger than I'm concerned we might, because there's a lot at stake here.
Thank you. But before I turn to you, Pamela, I'd like to just ask a follow-up question, Goldie. You mentioned renegotiation potentially instead of tinkering. When you're looking at USMCA and with all the conversations you're having with business leaders, are there areas that are regarded as deficient or particularly successful when it comes to this? What might be renegotiated and what might just be, we just need a little tweak here and
Yeah,
there.
see, here's a danger with answering that question for me, Courtney, is that in a perfect world where logic dominated and facts were evident, and we could have a rational discussion about trade and about the benefits of trade and how to ensure that prosperity is created and that it is shared, we could have a very different conversation. We could have had a very different conversation the last time around. To bring in things that that may not be still being addressed. IP comes to mind, and national security issues, other things that are creeping in. Dealing with climate change, all kinds of things that are really big issues that require leadership, that require collaboration, that require the attitude that we're actually going out to not I win, you lose, but to create the conditions for which North America becomes stronger, but particularly because it's a moment for us to play to our strengths. The world needs what we have. It's not just that Canada has it. Mexico has its own share of resources. Certainly the United States has its own. U.S. has become #1 exporter of oil and gas today. So we've got energy, we've got food, we've got critical minerals, we've got our nuclear strengths. But we also need to be a geography that builds confidence for capital to come from all over the world, that doesn't need to always be seduced with subsidies necessarily. Those are going to run out one day. Your deficits are running amok. So how can you create confidence that capital can form, that we can have access to labor and labor mobility, for example, which is a big issue for members, not just who operate in Canada, but operate around the world, is how do we get access to the talent? How can we move people around in North America? And that requires you to have a conversation that looks at these issues on borders, border security, and all the things that you're dealing with in the American election in a way in which it's not being portrayed on your national television set, which is a very rational conversation about what do we do to strengthen North America, which means we can play to our strengths, build a trade agreement that works for all sides. And there's always going to be irritants. There's always going to be some challenges. But let's get past those and realize that the competition is not from within. It's outside of North America. And we have to compete together to have a chance at competing with the rest of the world. And that's the kind of conversation I think businesses in all three countries, I would say, having spoken with many of them, would like to have and still perhaps are hopeful that we can have.
Terrific. Thank you. Pamela, turning to you, I'd love to hear your perspective, having tracked this from the Mexican side.
Yeah, I mean, the Mexican perspective is one that is, to a certain extent, is surprising if one knows the history of Mexico and U.S.-Mexico relations, because Mexico was always the hesitant party. It didn't want free trade with the United States. And now it's become the cheerleader for the review of USMCA. In fact, the president of Mexico just sent a letter to President Trump, or former President Trump, talking about his statement at the RNC, saying that he could close the border with Mexico, saying that that would cause rebellion on both sides of the border amongst businesses and state governments that depend on that trade, trying to appeal to the better angel of Trump's nature to avoid that in the USMCA. Mexico wants the smoothest, easiest review of USMCA possible. They're quite happy with the way it's working now. The current government didn't support NAFTA when it was originally signed. They strongly opposed it, but have come to recognize that it is an essential component now of the Mexican economy and generating Mexican growth. So it's a real turn of the tables where it's now the United States that's digging its heels in, and Canada and Mexico who are trying to encourage the United States to be less protectionist and more collaborative on the economic front.
Thank you. And a follow-up for you as well. I'd love just to hear similarly, what has really worked for Mexico? Where have they seen a lot of benefits? And if there is this uh, tinkering slash renegotiation, are there pieces that Mexico wants to tinker with?
Mexico really doesn't want to tinker with anything, because if it's afraid of it tinkers, the others will tinker back. And it's most concerned about maintaining its energy sovereignty. And there is a concern that that would be undermined if there were to be a deeper renegotiation. Also, is a concern that the United States would, under President Trump, would want to deepen the rules of origin in not only the automotive sector, but other sectors, making it harder for Mexico to source materials from abroad, which it is doing currently. But in terms of the sectors that are most benefited Mexico, without a doubt, it's manufacturing. Mexico is amongst the most sophisticated manufacturing locations for everything from medical equipment to helicopter doors to airplane fuselages, and of course, computers and automobiles. So it's been very important in developing that portion of the Mexican economy, which is highly competitive and is a very important input to US national competitiveness. We don't really have national competitiveness anymore. It's North American competitiveness.
Thank you. Goldie, turning to you, you're again coming from the private sector. What opportunities do you see? What are some of the primary opportunities for closer North American economic engagement in the future? Let's say, things, there is a renewal of USMCA. Are there areas where you could see better cooperation, or are there also some challenges that need to be overcome?
Well, I mentioned one and I'll repeat it because it is that important, and that is labor mobility. When you have a company that is based in Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and it's operating obviously on a very local level, and many people probably don't even realize that many of those companies are Canadian, and vice versa to some extent. You want to be able to move your employees around. You want to be able to fill labor gaps. And right now in the United States of America, and you have to feel for President Biden on this. I mean, the economy, and again, the numbers today show the economy is booming. It continues to be strong. And for labor perspective, it's very hard to find people to work. And so you want to, when you are not able to fill that gap, that's productivity loss. That's work not happening. And that's something that I think is going to be critically important. The other piece of this is the infrastructure piece from a hard infrastructure perspective, ports, airports, railways, you name it, grid, electricity grids, the supply chain resiliency that's going to be necessary to truly build an economy that's North American, that's integrated, that again plays to our strengths. We all bring something to the table. Some of it overlaps, which is fine. But to get that right as well. And I think the third piece is that the reason we've gathered here is to talk about the policy infrastructure, making sure that you get the fundamentals right, you get that foundation right, because there's an old saying in politics that money follows message. And I would suggest that the exact same thing also applies to business. Money follows message. If you get that message right, that says we are welcoming for capital, we're a place where you can find labor, we're a place where there's policy predictability and certainty. And that is not to suggest that policies never change, but they shouldn't change every 2 to 4 years. You can't be saying that today these are the rules, and they might change at the midterms, or they might change at the next election. That's very difficult. I mean, at least in Mexico, I suppose you get a 6-year run before things might change again. It's just not predictable and stable enough. And if there's one thing that capital really, really loves, is the need for stability and predictability, because it inspires confidence. And when you have confidence, you can deploy shareholder capital, like it belongs to other people. You are trained to use their revenue, their money to help invest and to help grow. So getting those verticals right is critically important, because capital is mobile. I don't use that as a threat. I just use that as a fact that if you can't make it welcoming for capital to form in your respective jurisdiction, it simply moves. And it doesn't move based on an ideology or a nationality or anything. The only anthem capital has is, where do I go to make $1 too? And it will find a way to do that.
Thank you. You mentioned, and I find it ironic that Joshua unfortunately is still hasn't been able to join us. But so we're having the Canadian perspective and the Mexico perspective here
I'm sure
without the U.S.
Professor and I don't
perspective.
mind speaking on behalf of Josh.
But you mentioned this idea of labor, and I wanted to use that as a jumping off point for a question for both of you, because Mexico and Canada are celebrating 80 years of diplomatic ties this year. And as far as I understand, Canada just reinstated visa requirements for Mexicans with pressure from the US. And so I'd love just, starting with you, Pamela, and then turning to you, Goldie, just to hear how Mexicans and Canadians are reacting to this reinstatement, like what the impact is. Obviously, this comes a lot into the whole idea of border security, but are there other ramifications that go beyond that political situation in the US?
Well, Mexico didn't respond well when Canada reinstated the visas. They felt that it was something of a slap in the face. Understanding diplomatically that it was under pressure from the United States. Nevertheless, the message to the Mexican population was that we were mistreated by the Canadians, and this wasn't an appropriate thing. But more broadly on labor migration, Mexico is in a position where most of the labor migration coming out of Mexico into the United States is not predominantly Mexican anymore. There obviously are a lot of Mexicans that are migrating, but the majority of Mexicans who migrate do so legally. They do so through established channels. It's a smaller proportion that actually does so without documentation. And the result of that is that Mexico, beginning in 2014, but continuing forward, has actively cooperated with the United States in managing the flow of individuals through Mexico. And because they're not interested in having transmigration anymore. The United States is interested in having an excessive number of migrants trying to come into the United States irregularly. But what that's done in Mexico in terms of labor force is a lot of these migrants have stayed in Mexico, and Mexico's actually trying to find ways to integrate them into the labor force, because a lot of them are educated middle-class individuals who can help Mexico beef up the human capital in its own labor force.
Thank you. Goldie, any reaction to that?
Well, look, I think it'd be preferred that the visa requirement wasn't necessary, but there's a couple of things going on here, right? First of all, the integrity of your borders is paramount for any country, and when you see a flow of refugee claimants largely coming across the U.S. border, there's an issue here at play, and that is that they are coming via a quote unquote safe third country, and that's not allowed. If you are in a safe third country, that is where you file your refugee claim. You don't get to to shop around the world and say, I want to go here and there. You are where you are, and that's where your claim should be adjudicated, from the UN Convention and Geneva Convention, et cetera, et cetera. So that is a position that I think our government has taken, and rightfully so, to say, hang on, we shouldn't allow a flow through of this migration when it's your duty to adjudicate their claims. And so that's one aspect. The flip side, the other side of that, I guess not a flip side, but another side of that, of course, is people land. The day this announcement happened, our Minister of Immigration, called me as a follow-up to just say, look, Goldie, I know that this is not ideal and so forth. And it's, but here, just yesterday, he said, a plane from Mexico came with 300 people on it, and half of it claimed refugee status. So you can't allow that to happen. The integrity of your systems are at stake there. Part of what we're trying to do to help address the issue that business has is to propose another mechanism, some way in which we can say to our governments, can we become trusted employers? Let us take responsibility for our labor force. Let us ensure that they live by the rules and the laws of the land in which they're going to be working, living safely and paying their taxes and following the rules and all of that. Almost like what do you call it in the USA, the TSA, and we call it the Nexus Pass. You got the special line because you're trusted as an employer. Because we have to address the issue of labor. We have to address the issue that there is work that's not being done because we can't find the people. And so that mobility piece keeps coming front and center. And this is another irritant that arises. that needs to be managed, but it won't be in the short term because politically it's too risky to remove those visas. And the downside of it is much less from a political perspective.
Great. Thank you. Welcome, Joshua. It's great to have you here. We appreciate it. I'm going to give one more question that's sort of a dual question to Goldie and Pamela, and let you touch the flow of the conversation, and then I'll turn back to you, Joshua, with the big elephant in the room question. But one thing that I wanted to talk about with you, Pamela and Goldie, is the CHIPS Act. Obviously, that was a big deal in the United States in and of itself, but I think it has ramifications for both Mexico and Canada. Pamela, just starting with you, what do you see coming from the CHIPS Act? And Goldie, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
Mexico is aggressively trying to take advantage of the CHIPS Act. I sort of return to something that Goldie said earlier, talking about the business wants certainty in the regulatory and operational environment in which they are located. And that's something that it didn't have in the past, really 7 years. With the new government in Mexico, the rules changed dramatically under López Obrador compared to Peña Nieto and the several presidents who came before him. And López Obrador himself would change the rules from time to time, which was frustrating. The new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, President-elect Sheinbaum, is going to be much more even-keeled. She understands that the regulatory environment needs to be consistent, and in order to attract investment. And they very much want to attract nearshoring investment, particularly taking advantage of the CHIPS and Science Act as well as the Inflation Reduction Act. So trying to invest more in the semiconductor supply chain. Mexico is already part of that supply chain, but expanding the extent to which it is, but also increasing its production of electric vehicles, taking advantage of the electric vehicle subsidies that are available and battery subsidies that are available in the Inflation Reduction Act. So two areas in which Mexico can benefit significantly from what originally was a domestic policy, but was then created or was expanded to become a North American policy.
Thanks, Goldie. Your take, how's Canada looking at the CHIPS Act?
Well, look, first of all, it's a form of industrial policy. A country has a right to, put its chips in whatever number it wants, and it went all in. I mean, the Americans have gone all in on the importance of, the IRA and the CHIPS Act, come lumping the two together if I can, because they're both really a form of industrial policy. The thing is, it's not really, business really didn't need it. I mean, I don't think business was hurting for capital. It wasn't looking for subsidies, but we'll happily take it. I mean, I think businesses will line up that will take it, and they are taking it. What we really need is that stable public policy environment that I keep speaking about. That's what you really want to see more of. This policy actually angered many parts of the world that I've traveled to. People say, like, what is this? Nobody, they never told us anything. We're not included in anything. We're all fighting to get in. And, that started with Canada, who also didn't know. And so then there's the issue of the US dollar. You can, do whatever you pretty much like. You're the global currency, and you are. But even then, math is math, and you've been downgraded by one credit agency, you've been put on a negative watch by another. So there are limits to how much you can go in terms of the kind of spending that you're doing. And then you have to ask yourself, so what happens if there's a regime change in November? You can't have tax cuts, deregulation, and subsidies all at the same time. So something has to give. So now what are you going to do? Are you going to turn off the taps and flip over to, I'm going to give you tax cuts and, some regulatory expeditions? And again, business will go along for that ride, but it can't go on for it all the time, and it can't go on for it for election after election. There has to be some predictable, stable environment in which to operate. And in the short term, I think what you're seeing is businesses are saying, fine, we'll participate, we'll engage. And they are, and America's economy, as I said earlier, is simply booming as a result.
All right, thank you. On the topic of elections, Joshua, turning to you, we will have a new administration in the White House in January, regardless of, just because of the events of the last week. How do you think that the outcome of the upcoming US elections might change the atmosphere of North American economic cooperation, from the presidency to what's happening in Congress? And what are some of the outcomes that you are looking at when you're thinking about this 2026 review?
Yeah, great to be here, and apologies for being late. An emergency came up, which kept me unavoidably. So I think, and maybe I'll start with 2026. I'll come back into that because that's really going to be front and center. This is the review that's happening in 2026 under the USMCA, which will be, in many respects, I think, the core trade policy issue for any new administration once they settle in next year. And there's actually really probably once people are in place, particularly if it is a Trump administration and there's a whole personnel change, one can imagine that there might be a 12-month runway because this has all got to happen by July 2026. I think under Trump signaled generally with respect to his trade policy that he wants to put a 10% across the board tariff on everything, a 60% tariff on products from China. So I think we're certainly going to be in a period of significantly more sort of trade disruption, potentially trade wars, because also other countries, Europe in particular, but others are much better prepared to respond, I think, to US essentially tariff increases on their exports. And so I think we would see a lot more kind of reciprocity and retaliation than even we saw last time around. So I think in many respects the Trump approach to trade is fundamentally a recipe for a lot of trade disruption and uncertainty. When it comes to the review, both USTR Thai, well, certainly USTR Thai has signaled that this was actually at a Brookings event we held in March, that they see this as an opportunity to put pressure on the parties to make some changes in areas that the US considers important. And there you can sort of go down the list and it's fairly clear what's on the US mind when it comes to trade irritants, both with Mexico and Canada, including the rules of origin water dispute, which they lost, where there's been a lot of ongoing industry pressure, not to comply, and the US has not complied to date. But also, dairy market access in Canada, which again the US lost that dispute, but the industry is not happy with the outcome there. And in Mexico, certainly issues around energy, but there are others around biotech and corn and so forth. So I think there's sort of going to be a question, and I think for both a Trump and a Biden administration, there's this open question of how they're going to approach the review. Are they going to kind of use it to essentially try to get Mexico and Canada to move on these issues that the US considers important, threaten to withhold essentially their willingness to kind of renew the agreement in 2026 as kind of the heavy, I guess, stick in the toolkit that you have in the lead up to the review, notwithstanding the fact that would be costly for US businesses if that was actually to happen. The only thing I would kind of add there is that USMCA was obviously the agreement that the Trump administration negotiated, and it's not clear to me how much that will matter to them. Ultimately in 2026, it is quite easy to see how they might kind of spin even that to sort of still want to push quite hard in the review period. So I think we're going to see a challenging 2026 and a lead up into it, I think, under either a Trump or a Biden administration. But I do think ultimately that my sense is that a Biden administration would be more likely, I think, at the end of the day, to renew the agreement in 2026. I think for a variety of both trade and broader sort of geostrategic reasons. I think there's a growing sense in the Biden administration of just how important it is to think about North America in terms of their broader kind of goals around chips and IRA and so forth. It's been imperfect and it's been in fits and starts, but I think they're kind of on that journey a little bit. I don't think the Trump administration has started thinking that way about North America yet. I think it will be much more transactional, and I think for that reason, there are higher risks that we kind of run through 2026 and don't get renewal of the agreement.
Interesting. Yes. And Biden, by Biden, I think you meant Harris, but.
Sorry.
I know. We all had to do this quick switch.
No. Thank you for calling that one.
Had we had this a week ago. I'm going to turn to the Q&A box. And if you're listening and you have a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A box and I'll try to get to as many of them as I can. Goldie, we have one here and the questioner asks, they reference that you mentioned IP earlier. How does the USMCA harmonize or protect intellectual property across North America? And are there any noticeable deficiencies in this protection or its enforcement? And how has this changed with the switch from NAFTA?
Yeah, very specific question that I'm truly not qualified to answer. I'll let the lawyers talk about it, but I will say what I've heard and seen is that we've only scratched the surface on many of these issues. We haven't even talked about AI, for example, and other things that are coming, that are happening. How are we going to ensure that there are rules, to put it simply? How are we going to make sure that that's the case? IP is something that I've been hearing about for almost 20 years. From almost every U.S. ambassador that's come up here has been raising those issues. So there must be work to do in that space. And as Josh mentioned, we don't know, which, if a Trump administration were to come in, what point of view they would be taking on their own agreement. Would they take the position that says, the greatest agreement ever negotiated was so great that the other guys had to keep it, and luckily they didn't screw it up and it's going, and I got to do a few tweaks, but otherwise it's pretty good? Or are they going to say the greatest agreement ever negotiated was completely destroyed in 4 years, by the worst presidency ever, now we've got to do it all over again? We don't know. I mean, we've obviously been spending a lot of time with people around Mr. Trump as well. And what you hear on a consistent basis is, you get ready, everybody get ready for the 10% tariffs right away. Legitimate efforts are going to be made to devalue your own dollar, which I cannot wrap my head around given the inflationary impact that will happen. But nevertheless, that is what's being communicated publicly and privately by that administration. And the idea that, if USMCA may not even happen. It could be that there's no interest in moving forward in some way, shape, or form. And I don't know what comes of that. Do we revert to two bilateral trade agreements? These are all in the realm of possibility, which is alarming, given what I said at the offset, right off the top, that what we look for is predictability, stability, and some confidence as to, we can have a little tweaking here and there, but overall, you can't make black white every 2-4 years. It just doesn't make sense. And so it's deeply, deeply troubling. And IP is just one of those areas that was not really discussed in the last go around, that was really talked about for decades, as I said, that we need to, if we're going to move forward with being a truly competitive North American investment climate, then you have to address some of these bigger issues that are out there.
Great. Thank you for that. We have a question here, and I'd actually be interested if all three of you would be interested in chiming in, but I'll start with you, Joshua. And the questioner writes, all three countries have recently imposed or plan to impose new tariffs aimed to respond to or protect against Chinese overcapacity. Any thoughts on this and whether coordinated external tariffs are a way forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is definitely a really important current issue. I think I might start by, I think the joint statement between President Biden, that was definitely President Biden and Lopez Obrador recently on steel and aluminum tariffs, I think is kind of an instructive example of probably where we're going to be headed, particularly on core products. I think that the US is very sort of focused on, and in that situation, I mean, the basic concern, right, is that with high US tariffs on Chinese products and essentially an open market across North America, you just basically create very strong incentives for Mexican products to enter, either Canada and Mexico, and try to take advantage of the open market to kind of enter the US market. So essentially to kind of avoid the bilateral trade and investment restrictions on Chinese products. We've actually, I will just make a small note, we've got actually a paper coming out on this. We've been looking at the data quite intensely to the extent it's happening. But I do think that, it's a real issue. So I think the question, the kind of the big policy question at a high level is essentially, there's going to be an economic issue and a sort of a political issue, which is that I think that some of this will happen in different markets and at different rates. I think the politics will probably get ahead of it in any event, just because of how heated concerns are about China. And I think the question then will be, to what extent is it really feasible for Canada and Mexico, particularly not across the board, but I think in these product categories that the US is very focused on from either a national or economic security perspective, to have widely different, essentially, trade policy, tariff rates primarily, but this would include, I think, the types of investment screening rules and so forth than the US has with respect to China specifically. And so I think, back to the Mexican piece, I think you see essentially, I think, Lopez Obrador, I think for his own domestic reasons as well, but also I think, recognizing the issue from a US perspective to sort of essentially, not entirely, but to essentially move their approach to imports of steel and aluminum from China to assuage those concerns on the US side. We're seeing Canada looking to do that in other areas, including EVs as well. So I think that's the trend we're going to see. I don't think we're going to sort of, it's not, I don't think we're kind of slouching towards a de facto customs union, but we are sort of taking these tentative steps, which seem to look a little bit like that in some areas.
Goldie or Pamela, would you like to add to that?
Let me jump in because I want to sort of add on to what Josh was saying, because the situation in Mexico, or the concern in Mexico, is precisely that Mexico won't be included or excluded from the 10% global tariff. And that will undermine what is Mexico's core growth strategy for the new administration going forward, which is to attract nearshoring. And Mexico's also concerned about the United States putting tariffs on China and Chinese companies trying to use Mexico as the backdoor into the United States, and that causing political tensions, diplomatic tensions between the United States and Mexico, which is nearly inevitable. And a handful of Chinese firms have already relocated to Mexico, particularly in furniture manufacturing, trying to take advantage of precisely the free trade rules of the USMCA. So the Mexican government, the finance minister rather, on Sunday gave a speech that a lot of people missed, but is extraordinarily important, in which he said, in effect, that Mexico is okay with North American tariffs on China. Mexico will be participate in that. He talked about the imbalanced trade relationship that Mexico has with China. It imports 10 times what it exports. And that's not good for Mexico. Mexico needs to produce more of what it's importing from China, an old sort of import substitution argument that fits neatly into the idea that you could have North American tariffs against China.
One question, Goldie, we have here, and I'd like to turn to you for that, because this seems to be something that is on your mind. And of course, Pamela or Joshua, feel free to jump in. The questioner wants to know the panelists' thoughts on the inflationary impacts of proposals. I think from the candidates, I think talking about Trump and Harris, but tariffs and other economic policies proposed by the candidates. But I'd just be curious to hear overall, especially since we're talking about this within the context of looking at China, what you're hearing and what you're seeing.
Well, I can't let the previous question go because I think it's an important question, and I was wondering when it would come up, and of course it did come up. This is we have trade agreements because there's supposed to give us rules, and within the rules are things as adjudication, dispute mechanisms and settlements, and you have to live by the rules. If you sign the agreement, you have to know what you signed on to, and you've got to live by them. And so that's what we're looking at on this thing: is are we all doing as we said we would do in terms of how we are managing the trade agreement? That applies to all contexts, not just the China question. The Mexican administration had already come out and said, we're going to have it both ways if we can. We're going to let the Chinese invest, and we're going to continue with NAFTA. They may get called out on that eventually. We'll see what happens. So that's one component of it. The other thing I'd say is we spent a lot of time thinking about the Republican side. There's been a substitution in the Democratic field here, someone who was one of few people who actually voted against the USMCA was then Senator Harris. And she also voted against the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, we'd welcome America into that partnership. You're not in it. You should have been in it, but it doesn't look like that's going to happen. So what does she bring to the table? And if her administration is there, what can we expect? And so there's a lot of unpredictability and uncertainty around some of these questions. And it goes against everything I've said that business is looking for. So we need to be cautionary about that. I'm not sure I understand the question on inflation. I think you're just saying that the CHIPS Act and IRA is inflationary. As I said, it is because it's obviously thrown a lot of money into the mix. And you've seen the consequences, right? Inflation has been stubborn and persistent. It's been difficult for the Fed to tame it. There's been lots of talk about whether they would be cutting rates. Some had thought they'd be well into their rate cutting by now. Canada just had a rate cut a second one yesterday. We're down to 4.5% in our interest rate here, and with likely more to come. But the longer the US waits, the impact on us, of course, is that it creates a spread on the US and Canadian dollar. The Canadian dollar gets devalued. And so for us, it becomes more expensive to come down and to enjoy the benefits of the US and so forth. And for you, it becomes cheaper to buy a lot of our stuff. And so there's a lot of things that are taking place here. What we're looking for is, where does it all settle? Where does it all settle? And, we've been through a lot as a world in the last 5 years in terms of events, my dear boy events. I say at the beginning of almost every business plan presentation I do in January is I no longer stand by what I'm about to tell you, because in 90 days, it could be completely different, because we've had COVID, we've had Omicron, we've had war, and now we're going through the changes that are taking place here in the election. So it's getting very difficult to be in that prediction business. But for the Americans, I will say, as I said earlier, you have to feel for this administration, because the reality is the economy has been and remains very hot. And yet the people that you talk to say it's not working for me. It was better against when the other guy was there. Sure, we were all locked up at home, not spending any money. And so you had a lot of it. And it's, how do you manage that? It's going to be very tricky for the new nominee, or soon to be new nominee, in Senator Harris and Vice President Harris.
Thank you. We're getting a couple of questions here on migration and the U.S. southern border. And so to the extent that that can factor into USMCA and North America, cooperation across North America, I'd like to start with you, Joshua, and then turn to you, Pamela. So one of the questioner asks, how could a change in policy on migration in either Mexico or the U.S. change, the economic situation of the two countries, and how can Mexico and the U.S. work together on this issue?
Yeah, I'm honestly not I don't spend much time looking at the details of the southern border. I mean, I do think so. There's a separate issue of illegal immigration, and let's put that to one side. I mean, I think the big immigration story, and this is critical for North America, but it's really bigger than the North American story, which is increasingly going to be access to talent, to drive our economies, and to really take advantage of all these investments that are going to be made in clean energy and semiconductors and other smart manufacturing industries of the future. I mean, you can start from just demographic profiles. The US and Mexico, certainly, the US and Canada less so, have actually got good demographic profiles at the moment. The US has always been a bit of an outlier amongst the developed world in having a very good demographic profile. But Mexico has got a lot, has had sort of a demographic dividend. And I think the question for Mexico has been, are they maximizing that opportunity as much as that they can? And, a big part of that is thinking about North America as kind of a more integrated labor market than it currently is. And how do we then also have the programs and the education in place to skill the workers that we are going to need for the industries of the future? And so this is a critical part of the broader kind of conversation around how do we make North America competitive and so forth.
Pamela, thoughts?
Yeah, from the Mexican perspective, they're very concerned that a second presidency for Donald Trump would lead him to do what he did in his first presidency, which is threaten to cut off trade with Mexico by instituting a very large tariff on Mexico, regardless of what the USMCA says, in order to coerce Mexico to collaborate on migration. So Mexico is actively collaborating with the United States on trying to limit the flow of migrants into the United States. Over the first half of this year, Mexican authorities had more encounters with migrants than the U.S. authorities had at the U.S. border. So and just yesterday, the U.S. ambassador came out and noted that the number of border crossings at the U.S.-Mexico border now is at its lowest point since 2018. So there is a lot of collaboration going on. And a big chunk of that collaboration is, I think, that the Mexican government wants to help the Democrats. They don't want to see a second Trump presidency. But also, if there were to be a second Trump presidency, they want to make sure that there is the sense in Washington that Mexico is fully cooperating, so they can't evade the possibility of tariff threats from a Trump administration.
Terrific. Thank you for that. The next question is something that you started to address earlier, Goldie, but I'd like to get different panelists' perspective on it. And it's about permitting reform it's about critical infrastructure. And so the questioner writes, permitting reform for critical infrastructure is an issue in all three countries. How important is it for the future of continental trade? So Goldie, do you just want to dig in a little bit more to what you were saying about infrastructure and sort of what that looks like?
Sure. Well, look, we survey our members all the time, what's keeping you up at night type stuff. And I can tell you in almost every single one, regulatory burden is number one, more than almost anything else, is because they don't control it, right? Someone else makes the regulations, someone else creates the rules. It is like driving them crazy that what is black becomes white, as I said earlier. And so the easing of regulatory burden starts with permitting reform, because we have built North America over the last several hundred years, and it's getting harder to build things in that very same continent now. You can't expand your ports. You can't, build a railway system. You can't build a pipeline. Like an executive order within 6 hours, the president becoming president 4 years ago, completely erased a $15 billion in planned investment by a Canadian company that was doing all of its, social license work, if you will, due diligence and engagement with Indigenous and everything. So you need to have predictability in the framework, number one. Number two, you need to have speed. We cannot take the length of time that we do. It takes 12 to 14 years to get a permit for a mine in Canada. Okay? That's just too long. Now, it takes that long in the United States, by the way, in fairness, in some cases even worse. And in fact, when your president came up here, all he said he wants from us is our critical minerals. That's what they're after now. And so I'm really pleased, and I've met on multiple occasions with Senator Manchin, who is really championing permitting reform in the US to get it down to something as fast as even 2 years. What does business want? If it's going to be a no, give me an early no. Tell me right away, that idea that you have, it's crazy. We're not going to allow you to do it. Don't spend any money on lawyers and just go away. No problem. We'll go away. But if it's going to be a yes, and there's going to be conditions imposed on it, that's fine. We'll engage, we'll take the risk, we'll hire the lawyers and do the regulatory work and build the social license and do all the things that business knows that it has to do. But we want to know that there's an answer that's coming in a reasonable time frame. 14 years is not reasonable. Maybe 6 months is too fast. What's the right number? Let's figure it out. But it can't be what it currently is. And so the efforts that are in a bipartisan way underway in the US are encouraging, because we're actually looking to you to do it quickly so that we can follow and say we can't be that far behind. And so whoever does it first is going to get a competitive advantage.
Terrific. Thanks. Pamela or Joshua, would you like to add anything on there?
I'll just add, picking up on Goldie's point about Senator Manchin. So, Senator Manchin, Senator Barroso introduced a bipartisan bill actually last week, I think, on permitting reform. And so I'm not sure if it's going to move, but, just underscores, I think, how important this is. It's not something that often gets a lot of attention in the media or high-level kind of policy discussions. But when you think about, I think it's clear when you think about the IRA Act and actually turning these investments into actual energy projects in a meaningful time frame, getting this done, I think, is increasingly seen as important. So they've proposed a whole range of ways to essentially require all the kind of due process that delays permitting to be, done within a very specific time frame. So it's essentially expediting all the judicial review processes and all the agency review processes down to, in some cases, 6 months and so forth. So, this is key. Again, I'm not sure if this bill's going to move, but it's on the agenda for sure.
Yeah, in the case of Mexico, the idea of permitting reform of the permitting process isn't on the agenda. It's not something that the current or the new government seems to be focused on. Indeed, they don't even seem to be focused on key elements of the infrastructure that is dilapidated and needs improvement, specifically airports and seaports. But they are upgrading land ports with the United States. They have done that. But most importantly, I think the most important difference potentially between the outgoing and the incoming administration as Mexico is going to be the ability to invest in electricity generation with clean energy. That's something that the new government is very much promoting. Lopez Obrador poo-pooed climate change. He thought clean energy was something for 50 to 70 years into the future, not for today. The incoming president very much believes in the need to deter and reduce the amount of carbon that we're putting into the environment, and understands the need to provide sufficient quantities of clean electricity to attract investment into Mexico. So we'll see changes in the permitting process, I believe, in particularly clean energy generation.
Courtney, can I just add
Thanks.
one quick point
Yes, yeah,
that's consistent for all three, I think, here? And again, the logic of what I'm about to say hopefully is self-evident. But business is saying, give us one project, one review. If you're in a federal system and I have to do a federal review and then a provincial review or a state review and then a federal review and the same thing down, why? Either we're a country or we're not. And if we are, then let's work together to figure out how nation building infrastructure isn't subject to different jurisdictions. That actually elongates the period of application, which is what I would describe as an own goal. We're putting the puck in our own net. We don't need to do that. We have one project, one review. That alone will expedite the regulatory process.
thank you. Great point. And Pamela, I just wanted to jump off on something that you finished with the last time, which is also a question in the Q&A box, which is about climate change and the environment. And does that factor into the USMCA at all? And are there talks within broader North America about environmental considerations?
I
Pamela,
think it's inevitable if we have a Harris administration, that will be an issue in everything that she does in domestic policy and foreign policy and in the review of the USMCA. If it's a Donald Trump administration, I don't imagine that it will be on the agenda. It's not something that he or the Republican Party seems to be concerned about. But in the case of Mexico, you do have a sea change in terms of from one government to the next. The previous government emphasizing petroleum and petroleum products for generating electricity, as well as a broader transportation in the economy, to a new administration that's interested in electromobility, interested in solar and wind power, and not just hydropower, which was Mexico's main clean energy generation in the past. So it is a sea change in the way Mexico sees it. In the United States, I think it just depends on what which administration we get.
Goldie?
Well, look, let's start with the fact that emissions don't respect borders. And so if we're going to have an adult conversation about how to deal with climate change, we have to acknowledge that what we're doing here is a global issue trying to be managed locally. And that's one of the sort of the structural challenges that I think we face. The various international gatherings are aware of this, and they tried to address this through an article called Article 6, something that I raise in almost every meeting I come to because I'd like it to have more attention. Article 6 is basically acknowledging what I just said, that emissions don't respect borders. So America can do whatever it likes, Canada can do whatever, we can shut it all down if you like. But if countries all around the world are turning off nuclear, turning on coal, we're going to have a problem. I mean, I am right now on vacation in my home city, originally of Calgary, where I am in a smoke-infested place because forest fires that are taking place and stuff. So we are going to have to deal with climate change globally. It's not something that can be done just locally. And technology is going to have to be at the key of it. And the root of this is what the industrial IRA and the chips is in part, or the IRA in particular is supposed to be about, is how do we get into technology? But you have to bring the facts to the table here. We have too many paradigms where it's either this or that, either or. It's and is the answer. We need to use conventional energy as much as we're thinking about using renewable energy and so forth. The environmentalists for a decade had said nuclear is bad, or longer than that, nuclear is bad. And then the facts emerged. We need nuclear. There's no way that we're going to hit some of our targets without nuclear. And so Canadian technology, Canadian know-how, Canadian resources through uranium and others, we're running supplying half the uranium to the reactors in Ukraine right now, because Russia actually has a lot of what Canada has and is cutting that kind of stuff off. So we're all in this together. We actually have to have fact-based conversations about this. LNG is going to have to be an ongoing use. America had no LNG a decade ago, led the world in exports 10 years later, while you told everybody else to worry about the climate. You're number one exporter of oil, number one exporter of gas. And yes, you're also doing the innovation piece through the IRA. And I think it's a mature response to the and piece as opposed to the or piece. There's just simply not going to be a straightforward formula of pivoting to renewables because it's not going to work. And we have to be honest about that in our conversations so that we can get to where we need to get to, because the reality is the environment is fundamentally changing and it's happening fast.
Joshua, would you like to add anything there?
Yeah, I mean, I picking up on Pamela's point. I mean, I think certainly I mean, I absolutely I think we'll see very little on climate with a Trump administration and under Harris administration. It will continue to be a growing theme. There's sort of a triangulation in part I want to just point to quickly, which is that the US and the EU are trying to negotiate a global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminium, GASA, so-called, which fell apart for various reasons. But I would expect that something like that may be being reinvigorated. But one of the underlying issues there was Europe's got a carbon price which is going to be applied in 2025. The US has got the IRA, but the EU system is fundamentally not set up to recognise the types of climate reduction efforts under the IRA that would allow them to grant essentially credits to US exports into Europe, or to avoid them having to pay the carbon tax upon entry into Europe. And so, these are sort of, so that is an issue that kind of needs to be resolved, so that we don't turn what are separate but important kind of climate measures into essentially a trade kind of contest, which it would become. And I think Canada sort of sits in the middle, because Canada's got a carbon price. It's probably more aligned with Europe from a regulatory perspective, but it trades much more with the US. So Canada doesn't want to be out of step, I think, with the US when it comes to, applying a carbon price and so forth. So I think kind of we have not yet really had a conversation, I think, in North America, and we may not be ripe for a conversation yet around how do we think about climate policy and these types of regulatory instruments that are coming in that are coherent and do not undermine the North American market. But my sense is that we may be close to having to have one, and I would expect that we might see the beginnings of one under Harris administration.
All right. Well, with that, I'm going to wrap it here just because I know we're under strict instructions to end at 1. And I just had a couple of quick announcements. So I just want to say, first of all, thank you to each of you. This was fascinating. Clearly, it's a very interesting space in our own backyard. And there's, I think, just a lot of potential, I think, as you all pointed to, as well as a lot of uncertainty as well. We have a couple of briefings coming up in the next couple of weeks. I know it's summer. Next week, we do have one on NATO and the impact of upcoming elections, running theme. And that is next week. And then we have on August 8th, where we'll be talking about the Olympics and the politicization of Olympics and geopolitics. So please do join us for that. And again, we are a nonprofit, and so we rely on donations to keep these events free and open to all around the world. So we do encourage everyone to donate if you can. And so thank you to our panelists. Thank you to the audience. It was a really fascinating discussion. Have a good day, everybody.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.